Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating historical argument from Jonathan Scott's Commonwealth Principles. We're going to explore exactly how ancient philosophy and radical religion collided in this totally unexpected way to spark the 17th century English Revolution. It's a wild ride, so let's get into it. Take a look at this. Thomas Hobbes, writing right after the incredibly bloody English Civil War, makes a wildly provocative claim here. He essentially argues that this massive, violent upheaval was caused simply because people started reading old Greek and Roman books. I mean, he literally blamed the learning of the Greek and Latin tongues for the effusion of so much blood. It sounds crazy, right? How could reading dusty old texts lead to executing a king? Well, that brings us to our first section, Section 1. Reading caused a revolution. Let's see how classical literature transitioned from dusty academic reading to a dangerous, radical toolkit. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what Hobbes and his fellow royalists were so terrified of. You see, these ancient texts didn't just tell nice stories about the past. They embedded deeply dangerous concepts. They directly equated popular government with liberty, while disgracing the very concept of monarchy by calling it tyranny. By reading about ancient Athens or Rome, English citizens were developing a really dangerous habit of favoring political tumults. Royalist writers suddenly realized that these ancient ideals of liberty weren't just abstract theories anymore. They were actively undermining the English monarchy, which, as we know, ultimately culminated in the shocking beheading of King Charles I in 1649. So we're shifting gears a bit here for Section 2, Rethinking English Republicanism. Prepare yourself for a pretty massive paradigm shift in how we understand what this revolution was actually about. For the longest time, the traditional academic view treated English republicanism as a purely secular political movement. They thought it was mostly obsessed with building new constitutional forms, and they'd often point to James Harrington's book Oceana as the ultimate example. But Jonathan Scott argues for a completely new view. He suggests that this movement was fundamentally a blend of radical Protestantism and classical humanism. In his view, it wasn't just about changing laws at all. It was a deeply religious quest for moral reformation, championed by a much wider cast of writers. People like John Milton, Marchemont Needham, and Algernon Sidney. Harrington's Oceana, actually highly atypical. Which naturally brings up a really fascinating question for us to ponder. Why did classical republicanism come to England in the first place? I mean, why dust off these specific ancient ideas during a 17th century crisis? So the crucial point is, it arrived in the moral service of a radical Christian religious revolution. The English Republicans didn't just want to copy Rome or Athens for the sake of politics. They totally repurposed ancient philosophy to serve a deeply religious attempt to reform society's manners and morals. They needed a toolkit to build a more virtuous, godly society, and they found the exact blueprints they needed in Antiquity. Let's break down those blueprints in Section 3, the classical toolkit. We're going to dissect the specific ancient ideas that fueled this revolution. It's incredible to think how these ideas survived for centuries before violently colliding in early modern England. Starting way back around 400 BC, you have the Greek moral philosophy of Athens and Sparta. Then, jumping to 50 BC, the Roman Republic gives us ideas of Ciceronian liberty. Fast forward to 1513 AD, where Renaissance writers like Machiavelli start advocating for expansion and civic power. And finally, we hit 1649 AD, the English Republic. This wasn't just a rebirth of one single era. It was a massive, unprecedented synthesis of all this ancient prudence into one volatile, revolutionary ideology. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how English thinkers treated these incredibly diverse ancient philosophies as a cohesive sort of mix-and-match toolkit. From the Greeks, like Plato and Aristotle, they pulled concepts of moral virtue, civic education, and warnings about the dangers of extreme private wealth. From the Romans, like Cicero and Soulst, they took the absolute necessity of an active political life and strict liberty from any single ruler. And from the Renaissance, specifically Machiavelli, they adopted the highly controversial idea of expansion over preservation, actually using political tumults or conflicts to actively grow a republic's power. But here's the thing. The English didn't just blindly copy and paste the ancients. They uniquely fused these elements together into something completely new. They synthesized the Greek love for intellectual contemplation with the Roman demand for active civic duty. They kept Machiavelli's defense of rebellion, but sharply rejected his break with traditional rational morality. And most importantly, they combined all this ancient prudence with Protestant Christian humanist theology. This entirely new hybrid allowed them to redefine tyrants not just as cruel dictators, but as literally any ruler who acted on their private interest rather than the public good. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, Defining the Commonwealth. We're going to do a bit of an idea autopsy on the single most important word of the era.
Take the word Commonwealth, or res publica. Originally, believe it or not, this concept was completely uncontroversial. It simply meant government directed toward the public good, based on shared law and community interest. In fact, medieval writers frequently used the word Commonwealth to describe perfectly legal, well-functioning monarchies. It was a very peaceful ideal.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because this word undergoes a dramatic transformation. In step 1, as we just saw, Commonwealth universally describes the public good, even with a king on the throne. But then step 2 hits. The Stuart monarchy completely collapses, both militarily and fiscally, plunging the nation into a brutal civil war. This unprecedented crisis pushes us to step 3, where radical writers entirely redefine the term. Suddenly, Commonwealth becomes strictly anti-monarchical. It becomes a radical justification that a true state for the public good requires executing a king and existing entirely without one. You can see how this creates a fundamental, totally unbridgeable divide for writers like Marchemont Needham and Algernon Sidney. On one side, you have monarchy, which they now equated directly with tyranny. They believed it represented only private interest and bred pride, greed, poverty, and inequality simply because it depended solely on the will of one man. On the exact opposite side, the Commonwealth represents the public interest. It cultivates self-governing civic virtue and is firmly, entirely dependent on the rule of law, not a person. And that brings us to John Milton, who fiercely demanded that this revolution couldn't just be a superficial change of political labels. As he put it, they had to go beyond the mere word Commonwealth and reconstitute the solid thing. For Milton and his contemporaries, changing the structure of the government meant absolutely nothing if they didn't fundamentally reform the morals, manners, and virtues of the society itself. It had to be a total overhaul. Jumping forward in time just a bit, this insight from American founding father John Adams shows how these exact 17th century English debates bridged directly to modern political thought. Adams cites the Greeks, the Romans, and the English Republicans all in the exact same breath as the principles of nature and eternal reason. So it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to ponder. When we talk about modern liberty and democracy today, are we actually just echoing the ancient philosophies of Greece and Rome, filtered through the bloody religious crucible of the English Civil War? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.